Today we are studying Matthew chapter 25, 14 through 30. A quick background first. In a memorial service, we usually hear this description of the individual. He or she lived a good life. But what does that mean? And what does it look like to have lived a good life? Now, in the secular world, this means, success measured by accomplishments, status or prestige. Living a wealthy lifestyle like driving a Mercedes Benz or live in a, $1 million house. In Silicon Valley, success is encapsulated by the phrase, he who dies with the most toys wins. Not that fame or material success is bad, but if all that a person has done is to accumulate toys, did he live a good life? Followers of Jesus, ought to have a different perspective. A believer wants to live a life that matters, one that has, eternal significance for God. And at the end of his life, he isn't counting the number of his toys. Rather, he is looking forward to be in the presence of his Creator and to hear him say, "Well done, good and faithful servant." So this phrase, "good and faithful servant," occurs only from Jesus' parable of the talents. Now, Jesus told two similar parables, but in different contexts. The parable of the talents here, similar to the parable of the pounds or the minas, recorded in Luke chapter 19. Now, both parables are in the context of a delay in Jesus' return, and both involve giving servants money to invest, in various enterprises. So the amount of money will be increased by the time the master returns. These are similar, but different parables. Jesus, who repeated his teachings constantly, from town to town, obviously told, this basic parable, perhaps in two different ways, depending on what he was seeking to emphasize to the crowd. When you first read this parable, it sounds like a teaching about stewardship. And we have taken it to be that. We have two sets of servants, faithful and unfaithful. The faithful servant uses the gifts they have been given and are welcomed by their master. The unfaithful servant hides his gift and is condemned. The parable seems to say, work faithfully with God, with what he has given you, or else. So there's an old saying, I already have enough guilt in my life. I don't need the church to add any more. So the ministry of Jesus, however, reveals a different kind of God. God did not come to get, he came to give. So this divine talent can't be possessed. It only exists in gift form. You can't have it or own it. And if you try, it will just evaporate. So don't sit on this talent. Pass it on. When we come to the parable that reads, for it will be like a man going on a journey. To understand this parable, we first need to ask, what is it exactly that will be like a man going on a journey? Well, the it in Matthew 25 here, verse 14, is the kingdom of heaven. The parable continues the theme of the master's return at an unexpected time. So the master's judgment of his servants is based on how his servants treat his people. So when Jesus tells a story about a man going on a journey, calling his servants and entrusting them to his property, we must understand that his property, the talents he leaves with them, is the people of his kingdom. In Jesus' day, a talent was, a very large sum of money. The NIV translators had good reason to translate the Greek term talents as bags of gold. These people are valuable to the master. Could these talents be a metaphor of the people of God? So the members of God's household were, like a sum of gold to the master. Our fellow servants and co-heirs in the kingdom could also be that metaphor. So in telling this parable, Jesus is not primarily concerned with whether you use your personality traits and unique skill to help the Christian community. He is much more concerned with how you treat the people themselves. Are you investing in them or burying them? If you fear losing your people and try to simply hold on to them, burying them, you will lose them. That would be like the third servant. But if you prove faithful, God will reward you with even greater leadership and responsibility, like the first two servants that we're going to see later. Now, here is the historical cultural background to this parable that the audience hearing Jesus would be familiar with. Now, most scholars agree that this parable probably had in view a historical event that took place 30 years earlier in the Jewish, nation's history. In the year 4 BC, the son of Herod the Great, Archelaus, went on a trip to Rome. Archelaus wanted to succeed his father as king of the Jews. Now, many Jews were not widely enthusiastic about this prospect. The ancient Jewish historian Josephus tells us that Archelaus massacred and murdered with the same zeal as his father. To succeed his father as king, Archelaus had to go to Rome to get the approval and support of Caesar Augustus. So before he left, Archelaus trusted his property and his wealth to his servants and his supporters. But while he was still traveling, a delegation of Jewish leaders and Samaritans sent out, a counter petition to Caesar Augustus, begging him not to appoint Archelaus as king. And they were saying, he's a wicked man, a brutal man. He has slaughtered his own people. Please, Caesar, do not confirm him as king. So if you were in Israel in about 4 BC, you didn't know who would come back as king. So which side do you support? Because if you pick the wrong side, there's going to be consequences. In the end, Archelaus won Caesar's approval, but the emperor did not confirm Archelaus as king, but did allow him to retain, his title as tetrarch. So he returned to his territory where he ruled until AD 6, a period of 10 years, after which he was, disposed of, because of his brutality and the constant, petition of the people to get rid of him. At that time, Rome appointed governors, such as Pontius Pilate, to govern its people. And so when Archelaus returned from his journey, what do you think he did to those who backed his rival? Or who sat on the fence and hedged their bets? Spoiler alert, yeah, he massacred them. How do we know this? Again, the Jewish historian Josephus says 3,000 Pharisees alone were slaughtered by Archelaus. Everyone hearing Jesus' story would have known exactly what the reference was. They had known that he was referring to the real life story of Archelaus, a ruler who journeys away and returns with rewards and punishments. So what is Jesus saying to us? That God is like Archelaus? Work hard and watch out? No, he's saying that there are times when Christians can and should call out the violence and corruption that everyone just goes along with. Jesus often loves to illustrate his message not with stories of pious and holy people, but with stories about crooks, loathsome kings, and dishonest servants. And Jesus begins these stories by saying, the kingdom of heaven is like this and like that. And the people are all like, wait, what? No ancient listener or reader would have thought that Jesus was offering a simple, morality story in this parable. Read on a surface level, you have, an undoubtedly evil king. You have servants who work for that king and who are, complicit in his evil. And you have one servant who refuses to lend or play along with this, vile charade. So this servant, the one servant who resists, is obviously the moral hero. This servant is saying to the king, if you're the dealer, I'm out of the game. You could read this parable as a story of heroic, resistance on the part of the non-compliant servant or the whistleblower who calls out the vileness of a corrupt king. The point is that Jesus was accusing some of the Jews of rejecting the Messiah's reign in the same way they rejected Herod's son. The parable assumes a time when people will need to be faithful before the kingdom arrives. Like some Jews who resisted the reign of Archelaus, so now they resist the reign of the Messiah, but they will encounter judgment. So Jesus seems clearly to be alluding to current events as he begins this parable. Jesus uses a political scene familiar to his audience as the background for his parable. So the key phrase appears in the initial speech that the nobleman gives to the servants he leaves behind as he journeys into a far country to receive for himself kingship and return. Obviously, this nobleman is confident that he will receive the kingship that he seeks. But not everyone did expect that. Verse 14. Again, it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. So Jesus begins the parable by introducing a man going on a journey. The verb is apodemio. Apo means away from, and demos means the people. So it's actually to travel away from the people, to travel away from, one's domicile. So the word suggests an extended absence. The man symbolizes, or could symbolize, Jesus. His journey is a metaphor for Jesus' earthly absence between his ascension and return. Slaves often held, manager roles. And so the rest of the parable implies the slaves were to earn a profit for the master. The slaves symbolize believers, each of them who, they have received different responsibilities. Believers are to go about their master's work and will be held accountable to him when he returns. Now, another Matthean parable that seems to preach, the law and not the gospel, is what some would say. But if we examine it more closely, there is a bit of gospel in this parable. The master gives talents to his slaves. What kind of person gives someone one or even two or even $5 to $10 million? This parable may serve as a warning not to hide our gifts, which equals law, law, and law, and more law. But the gospel is this: God gives us his assets in a way unimaginable in the real world of money. You might also say that God blesses his slaves' investments in a way unimaginable in the real world of money. The Greek word hupakonton does mean possessions, but it comes from the verb to be and does not simply mean goods, but the entirety of one's resources and means. Verse 15, to one he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2 bags, and to another 1 bag, each according to his ability. Then he went on his journey. So talenton, or the English talent, is a measure of gold weight worth roughly $1 million, 20 years worth of a standard person's wages. While this parable may produce guilt and anxiety in us that we don't do enough, it is worth remembering that anyone who gives away 5 talents to his slaves, not friends, but slaves, doesn't value money the way the rest of us do. 5 talents would be $5 to $10 million, 100 years worth of human labor entrusted. The master gave each slave a large amount of money in order to earn him a profit. He knew which slaves would be most, industrious, so he gave to each according to his ability. Now here in the Greek, ability is dunamis, which means power, in the sense of the ability to carry out something, capability. So the talents symbolize something given by God to his people. Some understand them as spiritual gifts. Others understand them as everything a person is and has, since everything is ultimately received from God. Now, the translators of the New King James Version misplaced the word immediately in verse 15. The way they translate it gives the impression that the master of the house left immediately. But the word does not apply to the master. Immediately applies to the person who had 5 talents. It turns out the word talents obviously is an unfortunate translation. Well, actually, it's not a translation at all. It's a transliteration. Well, what's the difference? Well, translation conveys the meaning of words from one language to another. Transliteration simply conveys the sound of words between languages. So how does that play out in this passage? Well, the Greek word talanton is an ancient Greek unit of weight, but at the same time, it's a measure of monetary value. It's like if I say the British pound. On one hand, it's a unit of weight, but it also has a specific monetary value in that society. The word talenton means something of great value. Oftentimes, the translators of English Bibles have to decide to not translate certain words, but just pass the sound of the word through. So talenton appears as talent or talents, like our English word talent, which has an entirely different meaning. So this has led, to a lot of confusion. So this parable is not talking about spiritual gifts or personal abilities. How do we know this? Well, there's a statement made at the end of the parable in verse 29, which we'll see later, but I'll read it right now, that gives us a clue. For to everyone who has, more shall be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who does not have, even what he does have shall be taken away. So the thing of great value, the talenton being handed out, is knowledge. Knowledge of how things work in the heavenly kingdom. When people bury the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven in the ground and don't let them naturally reproduce, that knowledge is what is taken away. Verse 16, the man who had received 5 bags of gold went out at once and put his money to work and gained 5 bags more. So the first slave is enthusiastic, went off right away. We are not told how the first 2 slaves put their money to work. What is important is that they made good, an effective use of what had been basically given to them. Now, 5, the number 5 could represent the first 5 books of Moses for the 5 bags. The writer's trying to give us clues with the 5 here. And 5 also means grace in the Bible. Now, the word gain here, kardeno, it's worth remembering that Paul said that all of his achievements were dung in order that he might gain Christ in Philippians chapter 3. And remember, Paul was a Pharisee, the highest level of religious, achievement in Jerusalem. So to understand this word gain in this parable, we're going to use Paul's view so you can understand this a little bit better using Philippians. Now, concerning the righteousness which is in the law, blameless, Paul says. So outwardly, no one saw anything to blame Paul for. He was basically a model Jew. Paul says, let's tally up our obedience and see who can boast. Paul is not claiming perfection, but the demands of the law, didn't touch the heart. Paul understood what Jeremiah said about God writing the law in their hearts because they viewed only the external. Paul is saying, I know the law. I had lived by its strictest rule. The one aim of their lives was to keep the smallest detail of every law. So Paul is saying, I took religion to the highest level. All this effort to pursue the law. And Paul says, it was all dung. And that's that Greek word skubalon, where we get the word Scooby. And I'm pretty sure you guys know what dung means. Here it just says rubbish. And so Paul at one time considered everything that he mentioned to be his gains, his profits, his assets. The thing that were gains, I have counted loss, Paul is saying. Having considered it all very carefully, I come to the conclusion that everything is a liability, right? Compared to knowing Jesus. Notice that it involved an act of his mind. He thought this thing through. So this is what it means to be a Christian. A Christian is a person who considers everything that he once trusted in to get him into heaven as dung. And they trust only and completely in Jesus. No law, just gospel. In Acts, the book of Acts, the men are throwing, if you remember, there's a story, they're throwing over all their valuable cargo in order to save their lives during the storm. Now, did they think that the cargo was dung? Well, no, they saw that the cargo, was valuable, but it came down to the choice of losing the cargo or their lives. So that's what Paul is saying. I am throwing overboard all my cargo from Judaism, the law, and I count it as dung. It's like taking out the garbage. You don't mourn the loss of your garbage. You're glad to get rid of it. the longer you keep it, the worse it stinks. So Paul is saying is that the only thing in life that matters as far as salvation is concerned is faith in Jesus. Any achievement that you trust in for your salvation, like the law, is dung. So hopefully this word gain, through Paul's words, helps us better understand this parable. Verse 17. So also the one with 2 bags of gold gained 2 more. And I'm going to read verse 18 with it. But the man who had received 1 bag went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. So while burying things in the ground was considered a valid practice for safeguarding, valuables, this servant is disobeying and basically insulting his master since he was supposed to make a profit. Verse 19. After a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. So here, the long time, it's the Greek word chrono. It symbolizes the time between, before Jesus' return. The settling of accounts symbolizes the eschatological judgment period. Okay, now there are 2 words for time here, kairos and chronos. And you can see here, chronos is the Greek word which refers to sequential or linear time. For example, the time we measure. And kairos is the Greek word that can refer to the right time. Okay, the perfect moment. And so verse 20 says, the man who had received 5 bags of gold brought the other 5. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 5 bags of gold. See, I have gained 5 more. So he gains 5 more. And then in verse 21, his master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. Now, the words few things here kind of seems inappropriate for the amount of money in question. Now, the Aramaic word, translated into Greek as joy, can also mean feast. So, to enter into the joy of your master probably or could mean to feast with the master. So those who serve the master, will have an abundant reward. So these rewards symbolize the heavenly rewards given to faithful believers and the joy of the messianic banquet or the feast. And so verse 22 says, the man with 2 bags of gold also came. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 2 bags of gold. See, I have gained 2 more. In verse 23, his master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. Now, verses 19 through 23 describe how the first 2 servants give an account of their accomplishments and the master's response to them. Now, the first 2 servants give, an accurate and nearly identical report to the master, differently only in the amounts of talents that each made. Now, the master's response is similar, word for word identical for the first 2 servants. So we observe that even though the first servant earned more than twice what the second servant earned, the master praises them identically. So we can assume that the master is concerned more with the effort and faithfulness of his servants and less with the, numerical value of material results. What is valued is faithfulness, not one's accomplishments in a quantitative sense. So the final scene with the third servant is the unexpected and unsettling portion of this parable. The servant makes 3 statements, and the master makes 3 statements as well. And so verse 24 goes on to tell us, then the man who had received 1 bag of gold came. Master, he said, I knew that you are a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. So this is a crazy statement to throw at your master. If one were to say this during their annual employee performance review, he'd probably be fired on the spot. The servant's evaluation of his master is clearly wrong. The unproductive servant is bold. I'll give him that. But he sounds almost like, he's accusing his master of being an, evil capitalist. Harvesting, he tells him, harvesting where you have not sown, gathering where you have not scattered. In other words, he's calling him a thief, basically. And this word hard in the Greek here, it's scleros, where we get the word scleroderma, which means hard, indurated. And we use it for our skin. And so, verse 25, so I was afraid, and I went out and hid your gold in the ground. See, here is what belongs to you. Notice that he says he was afraid. What does that remind you of? Well, perhaps to remind the reader back to Genesis. Remember when they were afraid because they had sinned, Adam and Eve. And what did they do? They hid. And so the third servant gives his accurate account and knows he has not fulfilled his responsibility and offers a defensive response. He calls the master with the Greek word, as we saw earlier, scleros, dried up, stiff. You won't budge. They're agricultural metaphors to mean that the master profits from the work of others. He's insulting him. The servant sees this accusation as plenty of excuses for his actions. A British journalist once asked Mother Teresa how she kept going, knowing that she could never meet the needs of all the dying in the streets of Calcutta. And she replied, I am not called to be successful. I am called to be faithful. That's what Jesus is implying here, to be faithful. So, verse 26 here, his master replied, you wicked, lazy servant. So you knew that I harvest where I have not sown and gather where I have not scattered seed. So the master's response is equally unexpected. He turns the accusation into a question. You knew that I reap? Like, how do you know where I reap and where I do not sow or where I scatter seed? How is that any of your business? So surprisingly, he doesn't debate or deny the accusation. The evil of the slave lay in his refusal to obey his master's instructions to earn a profit. The master calls the unproductive servant poñeros. We've seen this word before, wicked, morally or socially. Or a better translation is worthless, vicious, degenerate. Now the term lazy, okneros, means to delay, slothful, hesitating, or we say in English, idle, unwilling to act. So his motives were disobedience, self-righteous, and selfish. As a slave, he was morally and legally obligated to serve his master. Instead, he deliberately disobeyed and then excused himself by accusing the master. Isn't that what Adam did to God? Well, you gave me the woman. You sent that serpent. So, verse 27, well, then you should have put my money on deposit with the bankers so that when I return, I would have received back, at least with some interest. So the wicked servant has not been merely lazy, but has deliberately refused to do anything that will benefit his master. Now, there is no second chance for deliberate, rebelliousness. Scholar Ulrich Luz writes, Roman law designated the money given to slaves as peculium. In Roman law, the peculium always remained a part of the master's possessions, even when the slave could do with it largely as he pleases. So this means that while this money is given to the slaves, it is not theirs, and the master can claim it back at any point in time. In rabbinic sources, bearing money is, explicitly praised. It's a safe way to preserve things, in distinction from keeping money in a cloth, like in Luke's version. So the Matthean audience context matters here. Being at least, partly Jewish community, they would have some level of awareness that this third slave is not doing anything explicitly wrong. In fact, This slave has been the most honorable of the three according to the tradition of the Jews. Verse 28. So take the bag of gold from him and give it to the one who has 10 bags. So by his disobedience, the lazy slave has fortified his right to any reward. There is no obvious symbolic meaning to the 1 talent being given to the slave with 10. So the detail is probably just a way to, round out the story. So the master gives the unused talent to the servant who has 5 talents already, plus the 5 more he had already earned. Now, someone might question his action on the basis of fairness or perhaps need. Well, he already has 10, he doesn't need another. But the king is distributing his gift on the basis of faithfulness, capability, not fairness or need. After a trial period, the king now expects his servants, to have a track record of faithfulness and productivity that they can use his gift. So, verse 29, for whoever has will be given more, and they will have abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. So verse 29 is what scholars call a parenthetical explanation of verse 28, rather than being an actual part of the parable. So faithfulness results in more blessing. Unfaithfulness results in the loss even of one's initial blessing. Verse 30, and throw that worthless servant outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And so here, darkness, as you can see at the top with the yellow arrow, skotos, means darkness. And weeping and gnashing of the teeth is not referring to, being in hell or anything like that, but rather referring to maybe perhaps more to the Pharisees and the Sadducees, that they will be angry. They're going to be crying and with anger and gnashing their teeth because they're missing out on what Jesus has been offering them. And when they see it, when they see all the goodness that they were left out of, they're going to be angry about that. Now, notice how Jesus is less interested in stewardship, as many believe, and more interested in the relationship, people have with God. So the error of the unfaithful servant is not that he did not use his money. It is that he believed a lie about God. At the close of the parable, the unfaithful servant confesses his understanding of God. He says, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, gathering where you scattered no seed. Remember back in verse 24. So can you hear his misconception? Instead of a God who gives, he believes in a God who demands and takes. Second, who is this master Jesus desires us to know? At the beginning of the parable, Jesus shows us a master who is personal and generous. The master is personal, in how he gives to his servants. He calls each servant in and speaks to each one individually. In addition, the master knows each servant's aptitude. He gives according to their ability. Not only is the master personal in how he gives, he is also personal in what he gives. So the master gives them of his property, according to verse 14. So this gift is gracious and generous. Years of wages are offered, in an amazing act of grace and trust. The tragedy of this parable is not the failure to serve. It is the failure to truly know your Savior. Because a servant did not know his master, he died in his own lie. The third slave giving this explanation of an unmerciful God must mean that this slave has no idea who God really is. And that it is because the slave has rejected God's invitation of discipleship. It is not the lack of work that brings about the judgment, but the rejection of God and the misinterpretation of who God is. The master is responding to this explanation in the way that the slave expects God to be. The slave expects the master to be merciless. So what does God do? Well, he responds in the same way, because that's what you're expecting. The slave expects the master to be harsh, and so God responds in that same way. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Probably his thought. As soon as the first two slaves have money in their hand, they begin to use it in ways that will gain them more. But that was really never the instruction of the master. But it's immediately what they do. Why? Because power consumes us. Wealth and its, allure consumes us. We see it additionally in the response of the master as well. Again, there was never any explicit instruction that the slaves were required to turn a profit. But after the first two slaves produced a profit, well, then the master expected the third slave to produce a profit as well. While this isn't a parable on financial stewardship as something, it could be a parable about our vocation and rejecting the forces of this world that call us to live antithetically to the gospel. As Christians, do we have a moral responsibility to avoid and even stand against occupations and positions of power that exploit and harm others? Well, according to this parable, you could say yes. The question the parable asks could be, put in another way. How do people behave in the absence of God? Scholar Richard Robal claims that an ancient audience would have interpreted very differently than a modern one would interpret it, by the Western Church as being about proper investments. So Jesus' disciples are urged to use their abilities and gifts to serve God without reservation and without fear of taking risk. So this scholar argues that the talents parable is all about exploitation. Whereas a modern Western audience would applaud the first two slaves for trading and investing well, an ancient audience would have approved of the third slave's behavior and condemned that of the first two slaves because they profited at the expense of others. Roba explains, given the limited good outlook of ancient Mediterranean cultures, seeking more was considered morally wrong. Why? Because the pie was limited and already distributed. Anyone getting more meant someone else got less. Honorable people did not try to get more, and those who did were automatically considered thieves. To have gained, to have accumulated more than one started with, is to have taken the share of someone else. So this interpretation of the parable of the talents, meaning, cast the actions of the first two slaves as shameful, and that of the third slave as honorable, in an honorable shame culture. Someone might be insanely rich, but if they had no honor, they were not well liked or respected. The only way someone could accumulate wealth is if they took it from somebody else. The rich get richer only at the expense of the poor, which, in an honor-shame culture, was an extremely shameful way to live. What could be the application? There are many, but I found this one. Your talent is God's gift to you. What you do with it is your gift back to God. Please subscribe, please share. Thank you, and God bless you.